remember I was confronted at one point in Liberia, during the Liberian Civil War, with a pile of bodies. Civilians, men and women, children. They died in a mortar attack on a crowded refugee compound and had been sort of piled up. I just thought, we have to know how many bodies this is. Someone needs to know what the number is because people died, right? And so I counted them and I wrote down the number. It was 27. I was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1962. My father grew up in Europe. He was born in Germany and lived in Spain until the fascists came in 1936. They left, went to France. And of course, the Germans came in and he moved to the United States and met my mother. He was a physicist. My mother was an artist from Ohio. And so I grew up with this sort of split household of my mother, who was very creative and sort of mystical, and my father, who was a hard-boiled rationalist, very, very, really brilliant and quite hard to reach emotionally. I realize now he was on the spectrum. And both of those things really shaped me quite a lot when I was young. As a child, I was very shy. I was very withdrawn. I thought a lot. I mean, I just remember sort of just thinking about stuff and not interacting with people much. And I was pretty anxious. I was a pretty fearful child. And maybe in my early teens, that switched and I started doing things that were scary and sometimes dangerous.
And you mentioned your mum was a creative individual. At what point did you realize that you had a flair for writing?
Yeah, my mother was wonderful. She was a beautiful artist, this painter. She inhabited this creative world, and I always had this idea that what made life worth living was trying to understand it in some kind of creative way. Of course, that condemned me to, through my 20s, just flailing around trying to be a writer and all these other unrealistic goals. And I finally made it work, but I could have easily not made it work. I mean, I feel like I kind of got lucky. I got out of college and started writing freelance for newspapers and magazines, but I couldn't come close to putting together a living, any kind of decent living. So I waited tables in a bar, and then I was working as a climber for tree companies, 50, 60, 80, 100 feet in the air. And I would be up there on a line with a running chainsaw, taking the tree down in sections. But inevitably, I got hurt. And when I started doing the job, the guy who hired me said, he pulled up his pant leg and he had this big scar across his knee from a chainsaw that he tripped over backwards while doing some cutting in the woods, and the chainsaw came down on his knee. And he said, I promise if you do this work, you'll make a lot of money, but you will also get hurt. I promise you will get hurt. And I was like, okay, I'll take the chance. And I did. And I cut my leg with the chainsaw up in a tree. It didn't hurt much, but I knew I'd done something pretty bad. I turned the saw off and clipped it onto my belt and rappelled down to the ground. It was a bad injury, but it was repairable. And so they repaired me, and I was limping around for a while. And while I was limping around, I thought, maybe I'll write about dangerous jobs. Drilling for oil, logging, commercial fishing, forest firefighting, war journalism. There are all these jobs that society needs done that we depend on that kill people, mostly young men. Young working class men. It kills them all the time. And we don't really think about it. So there was a civil war in Bosnia in the early 90s, in 1993. I just thought, well, I'm curious about war. Like, my father grew up during war, affected by war. As a young man, I was curious about myself in war. Like, am I courageous? Like, how will I act in a war zone? I mean, and I think for a lot of young men, it's the ultimate sort of rite of passage. And I thought, in a somewhat misguided way, but not entirely, I thought maybe if I go to a war zone, I'll learn how to be a war reporter, and that can be my career. And I'll find out something essential about myself, and I'll find out something essential about war, which clearly shaped society. It affected my father deeply. It checked every box that I wanted to check when I was that age. I flew to Zagreb, which is, no problem. And then I managed to talk my way onto a UN flight into Sarajevo. I got a UN press pass, which was kind of, sort of meant nothing. But that got you onto a UNHCR flight into Sarajevo, and then boom, suddenly I'm in a city under siege that's getting, 1 out of 5 people in that city were killed or wounded by the Serb forces that surrounded it. And I grew up very fast.
When you got there and when you were in that conflict zone for the first time, how did you feel?
Well, the first thing you notice is that every time you hear gunfire, you just assume it's directed at you, and of course it's not. And then so pretty quickly, I learned to sort of relax around that stuff. Mortars drop out of the sky. There's almost no warning. And so if you lose a leg to a mortar or are killed, it's really a random lottery, right? I mean, at least with bullets, if you're behind something, they can't hit you, right? But mortars just come out of nowhere. And the Serbs were mortaring Sarajevo constantly. And so your fate depended on if you were on the wrong street corner at the wrong moment or not. And that sort of existential lottery it was psychologically incredibly hard for me to deal with. And of course, hard for everyone in that city to deal with. And it took a long time to just say, well, whatever's gonna happen is gonna happen. But I also noticed this strange thing, which was I got home and I was really depressed because it didn't feel like real life. It felt like I had discovered real life in Sarajevo, where people were sort of banded together to defend the city, and the stakes were very high, and everything was very raw and very real, and there was nothing to spare, right? I mean, everything was sort of important. Everything felt important. And then I came back to sort of soft, safe America, and I just thought, this isn't real life. Like, this isn't, what is this? I want to go back. And another component of why that called me so much was that it just felt really meaningful. Like, here I was one of the messengers of the world, right? I was going to these places along with other people who were way more experienced than me. And we were communicating back to the world, like what was happening in Bosnia and Kosovo and Afghanistan, wherever it might have been. That role just felt incredibly important and meaningful. And so what I was addicted to wasn't so much sort of, the adrenaline of combat or whatever. There's a little bit of that. But it was, I was addicted to a life that felt extremely meaningful, and it didn't feel meaningful back home.
What are some ethical challenges or dilemmas you possibly face as a war journalist?
Well, the big moral conversation eventually you have with yourself is, I'm making a living watching other people suffer, right? Now, of course, I'm running a risk. I might get killed too, but really, I don't expect to. And any time I get close to a kind of red line, I can go home. And there is a component of this, and war reporting is absolutely necessary, absolutely, and I'm extremely proud of the work that I did. But there's something about it that also risks feeling a little bit voyeuristic. And particularly when you are around civilian casualties, children, like unspeakable things. And you're making your living at this, and it can feel a little gross. And that's not the whole analysis. I can also say, it's important, we need to document these things. It's all true. But on some level, as a very close friend of mine said, Scott Anderson, an amazing war reporter, he wrote an essay about the psychological consequences of this for him. And he said this amazing thing. He wrote, I should be punished for the things I've seen. And there is a component of that, which you eventually have to wrestle with. On this sort of more mundane level, the ethical concerns are, is it okay to, when you pay someone to help you in this, like a local fixer, you're asking them to risk their life, right? And if it's a repressive government, you're conceivably that they're going to be in trouble with the local strongman who's running Liberia or whatever it might be. And you got to really think about it, right? Like, you can always leave. And so that sort of ethical obligation to not endanger the people you're with and your subjects, very, very important.
For yourself, how did you end up handling and carrying those emotional tolls of witnessing those scenes and then coming back?
When things would get overwhelming in the moment, I would shut down. Emotionally, I would shut down. I remember I was confronted at one point in Liberia during the Liberian Civil War with a pile of bodies, civilians, men and women, children, and they died in a mortar attack on a crowded refugee compound and had been sort of piled up. And I just went blank. I didn't feel anything. I felt myself shut down. Almost I could feel my neurology just clunk, just like shut down everything inside me. I just thought, we have to know how many bodies this is. You know, someone needs to know what the number is because people died, right? And so I counted them and I wrote down the number. It was 27. And I just felt absolutely nothing. And I actually felt quite bad that I didn't feel anything. I was like, are you a monster? Like how could you, right? You counted them? I mean, I really interrogated myself. And then I was in a lot of trouble with the regime in Liberia. They had accused me of being a spy, and I had to go into hiding. And I mean, it was a very complicated and dangerous and scary situation. Eventually, I was evacuated by the U.S. Embassy when I got back to Paris. And I really had kind of a breakdown. And it was because I had sort of like kept those feelings. I mean, this is pop psychology, but I sort of kept those reactions, those feelings at bay. And as soon as I was in a safe place, I kind of lost it. And I remember I was sitting in a cafe smoking a cigarette and drinking a cup of coffee. And I saw some men carrying a mattress across the street. This is in Paris, right? And the mattress sort of sagged in exactly the way that bodies do. And I just panicked. And I knew I was, intellectually I knew I was looking at a mattress, but my sort of like nervous system reacted to body, and it reacted to war zone. And I was practically on the ground taking cover in a Paris cafe. It was extraordinarily violent, sudden, catastrophic reaction to just seeing two men carrying a mattress.
And I know it's probably very difficult to pinpoint a particular situation or moment that stands out for you as being the most terrifying or dangerous. Do you have any that spring to mind?
God, how do you choose? The first time I was really shelled, I don't mean just a little bit, I mean like really shelled. I was on a hilltop in Afghanistan in 2000 with the forces of Ahmed Shah Massoud, who was the leader of the Northern Alliance. He was fighting the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in the north in Badakhshan. I was with his forces, and we were in a position that had just been that they had just overrun, they'd taken from the Taliban. And there were still dead Taliban in the trenches, and the machine guns were pointed the wrong way, and it was, it's like quite an intense situation. So we got to that position, and the Taliban counterattacked, and they counterattacked by shooting Katyusha rockets at us for an hour. And every couple of minutes you hear this boom, right, and just terrifying sounds, and like the fact that you could hear them come in. And I'd hear the descending whistle, and that sound still gets me. Like if I hear that sound, I will still jump. And it's been almost 25 years, right? You would think, oh, in a moment, I'll either hear the explosion, which means I wasn't killed, or I'll just stop. Like I just won't exist anymore. And that really did a job on my head. And then the other time that was really quite scary was, it was very personal, and I was seized by rebels in the Niger Delta, a group called MEND, the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta. They were Ijah warriors who were trying to take back control of the creeks of the Niger Delta from the oil companies that were exploiting it and polluting the water and ruining the fishing. And these guys were sort of like half criminal, half sort of noble, right? I mean, they had a legitimate cause, right? But there were a lot of things. But at any rate, I wasn't supposed to be in there. I was told not to go in there by their leader, a guy named Jomo, and I went in anyway. They descended on us in these speedboats, armed to the teeth, painted with white paint and amulets and all kinds of sort of witchcraft, and I mean just crazy looking, really intense looking guys. And they accused us of being spies, and for some reason they really didn't like me. And one guy came up to me. He had a belt-fed machine gun, and he was extremely strong and very angry looking. And he was just terrifying, and he came up to me and he said, "When we kill you, I'll be the one to do it." I just remember thinking, like, don't let your knees buckle. Whatever you do, like, just try to hang on to your dignity here. And it's like, at the very least, stay standing. Which I did. A few hours went by. We sort of waited to see what was going to happen. They were checked with their commander, Jomo. They put me on the phone with him on a cell phone. We had one bar. He was like, "I warned you not to go in there." I was like, I know. I didn't mean to, it was just silly. And And he was like, okay, we'll let you go. And then we got back to Port Harcourt, and I got a message from him. And he said, you made a great mistake going out there, but we now know that you're legitimate journalists, you're not spies. And that, you must have been quite nervous going out there, even though I told you not to, and I respect that. Would you like to come back out as our guests with my permission? And when I went back out there, we decided to go back out there. I almost didn't. We decided to go back out there. I was like, this might be the stupidest thing I've ever done. And it wasn't. And we were allowed to take all the photos we wanted, and I interviewed these guys, and they were just kids. They were just poor kids in Nigeria who had no resort other than violence. I mean, they had no choices. I mean, they had no possibilities, opportunities. They had machine guns. That was it. And the corruption of their country and poverty and basically the injustice of the world turned them into what they were, and which, these fighters. That changed me. I'd never had someone tell me they were going to kill me, and that leaves a mark for a while.
You mentioned your time in Afghanistan, so you spent about a year is it the Korengal Valley?
Yes, so I was, my history with Afghanistan started in the mid-90s. I went there in 1996 in the summer as the Taliban were taking over. Then I went back in 2000. I was with Ahmad Shah Massoud and his forces. He was killed. I went back in 2001 after 9/11 to document the Northern Alliance as they swept through northern Afghanistan and into Kabul, and they liberated Kabul, and eventually all the way down to Kandahar, which eventually fell to U.S. forces. So finally, in 2005, I was like, I grew up during Vietnam. I never thought I'd have call to document American forces in a ground war in Asia, like that, like inconceivable, right? And then there it was happening. So I embedded with U.S. forces in 2005 in Zabul, and then I went back with the same unit in 2007. They were in eastern Afghanistan in Kunar province, very rugged, beautiful part of Afghanistan. And so I was with a platoon of American infantry, the 173rd Airborne, off and on, multiple trips, off and on for a year. And so I really became part of the platoon. And in every sense, other than I didn't carry a gun, I carried a video camera. And I was with a wonderful British photographer named Tim Hetherington. And we were a team.
So after how many years reporting in conflict zones did you make the decision to step away, and why?
I reported from conflict zones for almost 20 years. Those were years of my life that were incredibly exciting, incredibly meaningful, sometimes very scary. I'm very, very proud of it, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. And then, as a Vietnam vet said to me, he said, in war, you may or may not die. That's up in the air. You'll find out. But you're guaranteed to lose your brothers. No one counts on that, right? You don't think about that. You're going to lose your brothers, people you love as much as you love your family, if not more in some ways. No one counts on that. And so in 2011, Tim Hetherington, who I'd been through the year in the Korengal with, and we made a movie called Reshaped that went all the way to the Oscars, and we were colleagues and friends and brothers in every conceivable sense. And a few weeks after the Oscars, we were gonna, it was 2011, the Arab Spring was in full boil, surfs up, basically, like, whoa, like we want to document this, amazing. And we were gonna cover the Civil War, the sort of social movement in Egypt, and the Civil War in Libya. And at the last, he went off. I was going to catch up with him, and at the last moment, a few days before I was going to leave, something came up in my personal life. I couldn't go. So Tim covered the Libyan Civil War on his own. He went to the city of Misrata by boat. Misrata was besieged by Gaddafi's forces. He got there in the morning, went out to the front line, quite a lot of combat, came back, filed, went back in the afternoon, back to the front line, and got unlucky. And a mortar came in and hit right next to him. and he took some shrapnel in his groin, and he died. He bled out in the back of a rebel pickup truck, racing for the Misrata hospital. Fairly quickly after that, I decided I wasn't going to cover war anymore. I watched what Tim's death did to everyone who loved Tim, including myself, and I just thought I don't want to be responsible for that for everybody else. Like, I'm not gambling with my life. In some ways I'm gambling with their lives, and I'm not going to. I'm not doing it. And so I stopped. And it was interesting when I got the news. It was just like with that pile of bodies in Liberia. I felt absolutely nothing. I mean, I was shocked, right? But I didn't really have a reaction. And I felt terrible that I didn't have a reaction. And then like a day later, I'd been asked to pen something about his death for Vanity Fair magazine that we'd worked for. I tried writing it in a sort of third person, Tim Hetherington died on the, et cetera, like arm's length. I couldn't write it, nothing came out, I wasn't feeling anything. And so then I stopped and I wrote it as a letter to Tim. I was like, Tim, man, I just got the news, I can't believe it. And, but by the time I'd finished that first sentence, I was just sobbing. And all of these feelings came out, not just about Tim, but from years of this stuff. I mean, it all came out. And I literally wrote the entire thing sobbing. And that's probably one of the best things I've ever written. I mean, I was really proud of it. It was my testimonial to my good friend. So, I mean, after all this happened, after Tim died, I was all over the map, right? I was a mess, but I was a mess that was I needed to be a mess. There were a lot of things that I never dealt with. I put on hold 15, 20 years of reactions to things. I just put it on hold. I put it on the plastic, like, no, I'll pay for this later. The bill came due, right? And I paid it. And I emerged out of that, like really feeling, oh, wow. So this is what it's like to be present. Like, here I am. I'm not blocking anything out. Here I am. So back in 2020, right as COVID was hitting, my wife and I had a 3-year-old and a 6-month-old. And we were living in Massachusetts. I was with my wife in this little cabin. We had a little bit of babysitting in the afternoon, one afternoon, a beautiful afternoon in June. And in mid-sentence, I felt this sudden pain in my abdomen. Oh, whoa, what is that? And I tried to work it out and I couldn't ease it, and so I stood up to see maybe I could sort of walk it out. And as soon as I stood up, I almost fell over. And I sat back down and I said words I never thought I'd have to say. I said to my wife, I think I'm gonna need help. And so what I didn't know that I had an undiagnosed aneurysm in my pancreatic artery. Now, an aneurysm is a sort of unnatural ballooning of the blood of an artery, and it's not like high cholesterol or a bad heart. It's not a product of other health issues. It's completely random, and the kind that I had, where I had it, was very, very rare, and they're deadly because, of course, if you rupture an artery in your abdomen, you can just bleed out. It's like someone stabbed you, except the doctors don't know where the stab wound is. And they have to go rooting around your organs looking for the bleed, and it usually doesn't go very well. I was losing a pint of blood every 10 or 15 minutes, probably. There's like 10 or 12 pints in the human body. And the hospital was an hour away. So you can do the math. I was basically a human hourglass. And the ambulance got there finally, and they took me to the hospital, and I had no idea I was dying. And we got to the hospital, and as soon as we pulled in, I went off a cliff. And I started going from something called compensatory shock, where your body sort of rallies a little bit and tries to conserve the blood where it's needed around your heart and your brain. And then it can only do that for so long. And then when it lets go, you're done, right? And I let go right when we pulled into the ER. And the doctors knew immediately what was happening, and they sort of rushed me into the trauma bay. And I went into hemorrhagic shock. I was convulsing, deeply hypothermic, in and out of consciousness, like not of right mind. But I didn't know I was dying. Then my memory sort of goes in and out for the next few hours. And it took them a long time. And the impression I had, doctors won't tell you this, but the impression I had from my records and from talking to them a little bit was that they were kind of skeptical if they could save me. But they used a catheter, which is a flexible tube, wire and rubber tube that they could thread through they put in your groin, right where Tim's wound was. My wound, I had the entry point into my body, the thing that saved me, was in the same spot where Tim took his piece of shrapnel. And it ruptured his femoral, and that's why he bled out. Well, they popped a hole in my groin in the same place and entered my femoral with a catheter and threaded it up through my chest and around, and then another through my left wrist. It eventually managed to get it to the hemorrhage, to the rupture, which was in my pancreatic artery. They finally got the catheter to the rupture and embolized it. They blocked it with a coil and saved my life. Then they knocked me out and sent me up into the ICU. And I woke up the next morning, very confused. And the nurse, I heard a nurse talking, and I opened my eyes, and she said, congratulations, Mr. Junger. You survived. It's a miracle. Like, no one thought you were going to make it. We almost lost you last night. I was shocked. I had no idea. I had no idea that I'd almost died. It's shocking news to get, and then the nurse left, and she came back an hour later, and she was sort of a middle-aged lady, very straight talking, like salt of the earth, right? And she came back an hour later and said, how are you doing? And I was doing terribly. I was throwing up blood, and I had a mess. I could barely lift my head. I was so weak, incredible pain. And she said, how are you doing? I said, well, what you told me was terrifying. Like, I can't stop thinking about it. She said, try this. Instead of thinking about it like something scary, try thinking about it like something sacred. So I thought, okay, I've been going to front lines my whole life and coming back with information that in some circumstances this could be kind of a sacred task, right? The world needs to know what's happening in Kosovo or Liberia, whatever it may be. So you come back, I come back from these war zones with this information, as do many of my colleagues. And like, how do we use this for sacred purposes? Meaning, how do we use it to protect people, to protect human dignity, right? So now I've been to the ultimate front line, like my own personal death. And I was allowed to come back. Did I come back with information? Did I come back with something that can help myself and other people live with more dignity, less fear, more connection? What did I learn, right? That's the meaning I took from what she said. Coming back from combat was nothing compared to coming back from this.
I read that you said that you were so used to having the threat of danger that would be able to kill you, but not your own body. How has all of this and this near-death experience impacted your attitude and your view on living, I suppose?
So one of the reasons that war zones are psychologically manageable is you decide, okay, well, that's where my mortality is at risk, is in the war zone. When I come home, my mortality, my life is not at risk. I'm home. In truth, it's like we all owe the mafia money. They will track us down no matter where there's nowhere you can go where the mafia is not going to collect their debt. Our debt to the universe is that we're alive, and eventually we got to die, and it's going to find you wherever you are, and not just in a war zone. And so when I had the aneurysm, when it ruptured, afterwards I suddenly realized, like, oh my God, any day could be my last day. I mean, all of us, everyone, none of us know that this isn't our last day. Probably not, hopefully not, but it could be. Just like it was for me on June 16th, 2020, I woke up that morning, I had no idea at all. Never crossed my mind that I wasn't gonna live till dinner. And by a medical miracle, I managed to, but I really wasn't supposed to. I had no idea. And so that really pulled the rug out from under me, basically. So I just didn't trust anything.
You've had a remarkable career and achieved so much, and looking back at all of it, what do you think is the thing that you're proudest of?
Being a father, and the kind of father that I am. If you put that aside, and just professionally, what am I most proud of as a journalist? I like writing things that make people feel smart, because they are smart. Like, we can understand things that seem beyond us. I research things that I don't think I can understand, and oh my God, I think I kind of get it. And then I'm blessed with an ability to write in such a way that gets other people to think, oh my God, I didn't understand the first thing about quantum physics, and now I think I kind of get it. And that I was sort of blessed with the ability to do that with words, to do that for other people is like, I'm incredibly proud of that. This woman came up to me and she said, you know, my husband's a combat vet and he came back and he had a lot of problems. And he read your book Tribe. And if he hadn't read your book Tribe, I don't think he'd be alive. That's a sacred process, right? Like I wrote something somehow, understood something and wrote something that has like helped people lead their lives, even though their lives sometimes are incredibly painful. So when I hear something like that, I think, all right, like I did it. Like I can be really proud of what I did, and I was in service. I was in service to other people. And that, you know, in some ways is the greatest honor.
Can I make one request? Do you mind though if I could be shot in the head and they then discuss this, and the mullah, another mullah was discussing, and they said, yeah, okay, we'll grant you that. So then it's like, oh my God, so I am being executed.